feel a little bit like I should be giving a sermon. All right. As Maggie said, it's a new subject for me. Perhaps it's a new subject also for most of you. Being a woman with power in a society that runs on patriarchal hierarchy is a very difficult fate. Interesting, but difficult. And many women have found that really the safest way to exercise that kind of power in that kind of a society is to do it either from behind the throne or within the privacy of the bedroom. But what about women who find themselves in the position of being the legitimate and public heir of power and who cannot exercise their power from behind someone else's authority? There are stories of women like this. For example, Urraca of Castile, Empress Matilda, the famous and infamous Eleanor of Aquitaine. These are all well known to history, but this evening what we're going to look at briefly are the complicated and fascinating lives of 5.5 Armenian women, who are much less famous than these ladies, but who, like their European counterparts, found themselves in the very ambiguous situation of having to negotiate power in a European male-dominated world. The difference between them and Urraca and Eleanor is that for the Armenian women, it wasn't a world that they belonged to completely. And actually, there were many more than the 5.5 women that we're going to talk about. The ones that I have chosen were simply prominent, and they happen to be related. And they got the most press, so we know the most about them. And I hope that you will find them interesting. But first, a little bit of background on what men from France and Italy and Belgium, to use the modern names for the regions that they came from, were actually even doing in the Middle East. Then a little bit of background on what the Armenians were doing in the Middle East, because after all, the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea is not really their home turf. The cities there, Mamestia, Darshan, Mamazarba, these are not Armenian names, and they are a long and arduous trip away from the Caucasus Mountains or from eastern Anatolia, which are the usual Armenian homelands. European men, in their thousands, descended on the Middle East, beginning with the year 1098, a couple of years after a very potent and volatile mix of religious faith, apocalyptic apprehensions, and general political misinformation, combined with one essential piece of European law to create a whole new world of opportunity that we know now as the period of the Crusades. When you hear the word crusade, what do you think of?
Knights in armor.
Knights in armor. What else?
Men.
Men.
War.
War. All right. All of these are true. So what does it have to do with the point of European law? Well, the point of European law in question was called primogeniture. Is that a word that's familiar? It simply means that only the oldest son anymore will inherit his father's lands and position. So what about all the other sons in the family? Well, they have to get by on their brains, their brawn, their daring do, and their cunning. So without initiative, or a good bit of luck, or a willingness to take up a career in the church, which was really not for everyone, the life of a second or a third or a fourth son could be a very poor thing indeed. So, in 1095, when Pope Urban II preached the need for a crusade to liberate Jerusalem, the holy city of Christ, from Islamic control, he appealed to many people's practical needs as well as to their faith. The majority of the Crusader leadership, then, no surprise, are not oldest sons. What is more, the most important of them were relatives to one another. And it's this little related group of men who have the greatest interaction with the Armenians. And so they set off into the Middle East, being led by, first of all, the guy in gray in the middle of this picture. His name is Bohemond. Actually, it wasn't his name, but it was a nickname he took. He came from the family that ruled Sicily, which was at the time the most sophisticated and prosperous region of Europe in his day. He was very famous for many things, some of them good, some of them not so good. He was famous for his height, he was famous for his build, and he was famous for his blonde hair. The Byzantine princess Anna Komnena describes him with grudging admiration, and it sounded quite a lot like she thought he was pretty hot. His combination of qualities was certainly good enough to win him this marriage with the daughter of the King of France. The second leader is probably the only one of the three that you might not have minded having want to date your daughter. His name is Godfrey, and his friends described him as having knees like a camel because there were so many calluses on them from his frequent kneeling in prayer. He was genuine, he was courageous, he was just a little bit boring probably, and he was also incompetent as an administrator because he bankrupted his own lands before setting out on the crusade to find more. He was arguably the only man involved in the crusade leadership who signed up to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslim infidels with pure motives. He did not intend to profit in any way from the crusade, and as it turned out, he didn't. When he was eventually chosen as the first crusading king of Jerusalem in 1099, he refused the title of king and said that instead he would rather have the title protector of the Holy Sepulchre. It was really quite unbelievable that he was the brother of his brother Baldwin, who was short, dark, and unscrupulous. Something happened to split the genes in that family. This is what Baldwin looks like. You can see him on the left, receiving homage from the Armenians in Edessa. We'll come back to that momentarily. In this time period, Jerusalem was considered to be the center of the world. And you can see it there, the little red dot in the middle of the map. It was also, of course, the focus of the crusade. However, three of the crusading leaders were not as much concerned with Jerusalem as they were with their own future status. And long before the army actually reached the Holy City, each one of them grabbed territory along the Cilician coastline. Baldwin took Edessa, one of their cousins took the cities of Mamestia and Tarsus, Bohemond set up his headquarters in Antioch, and each one of these takeovers involved intrigue, chicanery, treachery sometimes, scandal, that we don't really have time to go in here, but if you should have the chance and you enjoy that kind of reading, you will enjoy finding out more about it. The result of this trip to Jerusalem was this: a world that was ruled by crusaders along the coast, thereby guaranteeing that there would be problems in the future, because if you close off the coastline for people who are farther inland, naturally they're going to want at some point to get to the sea. What are the names of these principalities? Can you see them on the map? What have you got? I can't see it from this angle, so you'll have to
The
tell me.
Principality of Armenian.
All right. Yeah, Principality of Armenian Cilicia. It's going to be in another 100 years the kingdom of Armenian Cilicia.
County of Edessa,
The county of Edessa, big piece of property.
which is Urfa.
Yes, which is Urfa, famous in Armenian history as the home of King Abga. What else have you got? What's the blue thing there? That's
Antioch.
probably hard to
Antioch.
say. Ah, okay. So you have the Principality of Antioch, and then the red thing down below it,
Tripoli.
the county of Tripoli. All right? So down below that, the white section is the kingdom of Jerusalem. So, as you can see, the seacoast there, except for the purple bits that are Byzantine, is controlled by crusaders. Interesting. This is the world that will be controlled by Armenian women. Well, when they came into this world, the crusaders found themselves in a very different place from anything that they were used to. The luxury of Byzantine palaces, decorated like this, laid out like this, was extremely different from the austere kind of architecture, the plainness, all that green space there is for sheep, the dark, and the cold of life in their own European castles. And even those crusaders who had been on pilgrimage to Jerusalem before, and who kind of knew what the Middle East looked like, were taken aback by the luxurious life that their Eastern Christian counterparts were living. Well, in their various escapades and conquests, the Crusaders were assisted by Cilician Armenians. And interestingly, there were several different ethnic groups in the area, including other Christians, but the Crusaders chose to relate almost exclusively with Armenians. Why would that be? Well, from the Crusader point of view, Armenian society was familiar to them. It was organized in the same way that their own was, with a recognized class of free knights, a hierarchy of nobility, who lived in castles, kind of like this one at Cervantikar. You can see the view is great from this castle. And so the Crusaders and the Armenians gradually got to know one another, and the Crusaders soon grasped and made use of the tension that there was in the Armenian community between Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian Armenian Christians. They got that, but they did not understand the real differences between their own kind of noble hierarchy and that of the Armenians. They also did not understand at all the difference in status between European and Armenian women. From the Armenian point of view, the Crusaders, they looked on them as a potential ally in increasing the size of Armenian Cilicia and decreasing the power of Byzantium in their area. And they looked on the Crusaders as maybe a pathway to increasing Armenian wealth through contact with Europe. For their part, they did not understand at all the Crusader fixation on holy war. That sounds Islamic. And they did not share the Crusaders' conviction that somehow slaughtering Muslims would wipe out their past sins, something that Crusaders were counting on. And the Armenians certainly didn't understand that to the Crusaders, they were expendable allies. It should also be said, I mean, really, you would know this anyway, that each side found the other side exotic. Armenians admired the tall, blonde, blue-eyed foreigners, and the Crusaders admired the sultry, dark-haired, dark-eyed natives. I mean, really, what's not to like? The extraordinary lives of the Armenian women rulers played out against this backdrop of politics, finance, cultural disconnects, self-interest, and XX large personalities. Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders in July of 1099. And then Godfrey, who's being shown here, elevated by his men in order to receive the honor of becoming protector of the Holy Tomb, he was only able to hold on to that position for a little less than a year. And then he died. When he died, his brother Baldwin, his polar opposite, was called from Edessa to replace him. And unlike Godfrey, Baldwin had no problem whatsoever with being called King of Jerusalem, even though the only previous King of Jerusalem that he was aware of was Christ. He didn't see any difficulty putting himself in that category. And in order to hold on to his old properties in Edessa, which he didn't want to give up for his new job, he named his cousin, also Baldwin, Baldwin de Bourg, as the new prince there in his absence. And this is where the Armenian women begin to come into the story, because both the Baldwins, the one who became king and the one who was named to hold the county of Edessa, they were both married to Armenian women in quite different circumstances. King Baldwin's European wife and his children had come on the crusade together with him, and they had died in Marash before Baldwin even came to Edessa. But the fact that he was a grieving widower did not prevent Baldwin from very quickly marrying an Armenian woman who would help him to negotiate a high position in his newly adopted region. He had probably already met her while his wife was dying in Marash. Her name, nobody knows for sure. It may or may not have been Arda, but that's how history remembers her. Her father was Marash's Prince Tatu, and she was a Chalcedonian Armenian. Theirs was a bitterly unhappy and acrimonious alliance. Baldwin came from a world where women did what they were told and knew that they were pawns. Arda is not from Europe. Arda was a noblewoman of the East, used to relative freedom and autonomy, as well as to having substantial rights and power. To Baldwin, Arda was a misbehaving tool. She did not know her place and wouldn't stay in it if she did know it. To Arda, Baldwin was a heartless user. He extorted money from her father on several occasions. Makes you wonder if maybe he also threatened her to get money from her father. They were childless, not surprisingly. It's doubtful that he would have divorced her while he was in her home territory. He really needed Armenian support in order to maintain his rule in Edessa. But once he became king of Jerusalem, Arda's days as queen were numbered. This is an illustration with a caption, Queen Arda visits a nunnery. Do you think that caption is accurate? What's happening in that picture?
She's sent away to her.
Yes, she's not visiting. She's being taken into the sisterhood, and her husband is standing by to make sure that the doors close with her on the inside. As soon as she was tucked away, Baldwin went on to marry another woman. However, he somehow in there forgot to divorce Arda, and that caused some complications later. When Baldwin eventually died in 1118 on a campaign in the southern part of his kingdom, he was childless and without a wife. His body, minus the internal organs, was returned to Jerusalem. And it's one of those odd coincidences of history. They were bringing his body in one gate of the city at the same time as they were carrying him in through the Jaffa Gate towards Holy Sepulchre Church. His cousin, Baldwin de Bourg, whom he had left in Edessa, was coming in the other gate of the city with an entourage from Edessa in order to begin a pilgrimage. And it seemed to everybody like this was just the most wonderful, divinely planned coincidence. Baldwin, coming into the city alive, was proclaimed instantly as the new king of Jerusalem. After all, it was just too good to have him right there, ready to go. Put him in place. So he left Edessa to a man named Josely de Courtenay, Jocelyn with the short nose, another crusader married to an Armenian wife, Beatrice Rupenia, the sister of Prince Leo II. So, at the moment when he ascended the throne, Baldwin, who's shown in this picture, doing what? What does it look like he's doing? What? Say that so everyone can hear it. What did you say? It looks like he's playing patty cake. Well, actually, he's in council, consulting with his nobility, and that was his favorite form of government. He liked to have other people involved in what he did. He was a very friendly and outgoing kind of guy. And at the time when he became king, he had been happily married to his Armenian wife, Morphia, for 17 years. They were the parents of 3 daughters, Melisent, Alice, and Odierna. And a 4th daughter named Yvette would be born to them in Jerusalem. There's no picture of Morphia that I've ever been able to find, but she was the daughter of Prince Capriel of Melitene, Malatia. And like Arda, she's a Chalcedonian Armenian. Her father was one of the Armenian princes whose lands fell within the county of Edessa. And although marrying her was certainly a good move for solidifying the goodwill of the Armenians in his neighborhood, Baldwin did not marry her for territorial advantage. He did marry up, as many men do who marry Armenian women, but he seems to have married for love. And his wife's devotion to him was legendary. Theirs was one of the very few harmonious intermarriages amongst the Crusading elite and the Armenians. In fact, Baldwin postponed his coronation for almost a year, until Christmas, 1119, so that Morphia could travel from Edessa, wind up their business there, pack up the kids, and get to Jerusalem in order to be crowned by his side in Bethlehem at Christmas. It was a very beautiful ceremony. As the second Armenian queen of Jerusalem, Morphia really preferred to be the power behind the throne. She seems never to have reminded her husband that he would not have been able to grow or maintain his power without her money. Perhaps it was just her personality to wield power in a delicate way. Or maybe she felt a little vulnerable because she hadn't produced a son. And indeed, according to the historian Matthew of Edessa, many people kept encouraging Baldwin to divorce his wife and marry a younger woman who could bring him a better alliance and maybe also a male heir. Maybe she had also learned something from the ephemeral reign of Arda, whatever her name really was. However Morphia thought about her position, she did not seize power for herself, even when she could have done so, and the occasion presented itself in 1123 or 1124, after she'd been in Jerusalem for about 5 or 6 years. And she proved herself worthy of power had she chosen to claim it. In 1123, her husband, Baldwin, who's shown there in the blue chemise with his hands in front of him, was captured by Muslims during a campaign to liberate his cousin and his successor in Edessa. With his cousin Jocelyn and with other prisoners of war, Baldwin was taken. Does anybody recognize this? And incarcerated in the fortress there. And he stayed for a couple of years, while, together with Jocelyn's wife, Morphia tried to use her Armenian connections in order to hire men who could get into Kharkiv without attracting attention, which means Armenians, who went in to Kharkiv fortress, disguised as merchants, and were able, they couldn't find Baldwin because he was the more valuable prisoner, he was farther inside the castle. But they were able to liberate Jocelyn, and he set off to gather an army in order to rescue Baldwin, knowing that, of course, they were going to come back for him. Baldwin's captors carried him off from Kharkiv to an even more secure location, although it doesn't look like it now. There's not that much left of the fort, in Haran. Morphia traveled north, personally, to be near her husband and to assist in the negotiations for his ransom. She agreed to pay the Muslims 80,000 dinars, give them the city of Aleppo, and 5 other towns, and a few more things. And as a security deposit, she paid the Muslims 20,000 dinars up front, and she gave them her then 5-year-old youngest daughter, Yvette, and the children of 10 other nobles as hostages for their parents' good behavior. And Baldwin was set free. And no, he didn't hand over to the Muslims the city of Aleppo. He argued once he got out that Aleppo didn't legally belong to him, so he couldn't give it to them. And of course they were disappointed, but I don't think they were really expecting it. What they totally wanted was the money. And he did pay them the remaining 60,000 dinars of his ransom, which he got by raiding Muslims. So it was, as he was just offering them back their own money, and it all worked out well. Morphia had done very well. She had given up nothing that would damage her husband's interests. She had acted like his own mind in negotiating for his release. He was devastated when she died 2 years later. Their oldest daughter, Melisande, was 25 years old and unmarried, probably because her father wanted to be very, very, very careful about the credentials of his future son-in-law. Melisande's younger sisters, Alice and Odierna, had been married to men who would cement their father's local alliances. We'll talk about them more in a few minutes. But Melisande was really too valuable a commodity for a local marriage. Whoever married her, after all, was going to be responsible for maintaining the whole of Western Christian presence in the Middle East. He would need to have a vast fortune. He would need to have broad administrative experience, excellent military skills, and wonderful European connections. Such a man would not be cheap. He would come with a price tag, and there would definitely be strings attached to him. So, Baldwin wanted to be very careful about who he picked and what exactly those strings might be. After the period of mourning for Morphia, on the recommendation of the King of France, Baldwin entered into serious negotiations with this man, the wealthiest and most prestigious French military noble of the time. His name was Fulk of Anjou, a man who was said to be at least as powerful as the King of France, which is probably why the King of France wanted him out of France. He was a widower with grown children. That was a problem. He had just married his son to the future Empress Matilda, who we saw at the beginning of the slides. And thus, Fulk had already positioned himself to be the grandfather of the next King of England. In other words, he's a major player in European politics, extremely well connected, had vast fortune of his own, and was a well-respected military commander. He was also short, red-haired, freckled, bow-legged, not a young girl's ideal, perhaps. But he did know his own value, and the price that he demanded for coming to the Middle East and marrying Melisande was very high. He wanted the kingship outright, not through Melisande, who was the heir of her father. In other words, he wanted Baldwin to disenfranchise his daughter in order to make this marriage work. And Baldwin, surely in consultation with his daughter, took a calculated risk on this and agreed. You can always take your word back later, especially if things work out really well for the couple. So what Melisande thought of her husband, we do not know. But within a year, they had their first child in 1130, and it was a son, and they named him Baldwin for his grandfather. And then Baldwin sensed that his end was near. And so he held a coronation ceremony so that he would have control over exactly how it went, where he named all three of them, his daughter Melisande, who had the right to rule, Fulk, who had claimed the right to rule, and little Baldwin as his successors. So what is wrong with this picture? This is a picture of, you can see Baldwin at the top on his deathbed, and down at the bottom, what's happening? Yeah, there's a coronation going on. So what's wrong with the picture? Yes. It's just Fulk in this picture. And that's not how it went. Baldwin insisted that the three of them be crowned together as his successors. So, this is much more accurate. It makes you think that this one was probably painted by somebody who wanted something from Fulk. Whereas this one is more accurate. The two of them are being crowned together. And Baldwin was also very clear and explicit that he named only Melisande as the regent for her son. Fulk had nothing to do with raising the child, even though the child was physically his. The child is never shown in any of the illustrations, but perhaps he wasn't there. When Baldwin actually passed away in 1131, the European nobility, now living in Jerusalem, indigenized into Jerusalem, really found Fulk hard to take. They didn't like his aggressive ways. Things that he had done in France that had really furthered his position there grated on the nerves of people who had been taught by Baldwin to appreciate conciliar leadership. And they fully supported Melisande because, according to the laws of the kingdom, oldest child reigns. It doesn't matter what the child's gender is. And Fulk, although he shared the throne with her, worked to undermine her power whenever it was possible. At the same time, he's also trying to gain the favor of the nobility. He was a notable builder in his own property. This is one of the fortresses and palaces that he built in France. He also set up very strategically placed fortifications for the protection of his country, something that his nobility appreciated as military men. This is all that's left of his fortification at Ervine, which is on the Mediterranean coast, Bay Gavry, slightly inland, and then Blanche-Garde, which was on the plain leading up towards Jerusalem. So he very cleverly fortified the most vulnerable part of the kingdom's access, and people did appreciate him for that. But then he went just one step too far against his wife's rights. How did he do it? One of the nobles who resisted Fulk's heavy-handed attempt to take all of the power from Melisande was Melisande's cousin and childhood playmate named Hugh. He's described as being the most handsome and charming man in all of the Middle East, and he was the count of the port of Jaffa, so an important player in Jerusalem. And Fulk saw a way to kill two birds with one stone, to use a kind of bad metaphor considering what happened next, how he could eliminate the leader of the opposition against him and cut Melisande's power a step further at the same time. He accused her of having an affair with Hugh. It wasn't totally out of the realm of possibility. They did grow up together, and he was very good looking, and there may very well have been some kind of early attachment between them. And it would be almost impossible for her not to contrast Hugh, her wonderful playmate, with the man she married, who was a power broker if there ever was one. But an affair after her marriage, she's not the kind, really. And things then got extremely complicated. Fulk banished Hugh from the kingdom for 3 years, and Hugh obediently bought a ticket for Italy, but before boarding the ship, he came up to Jerusalem in order to say goodbye to his cousin. And while he was in Jerusalem, waiting to go back to the coast, he stopped in a tavern. Can you see what he's doing? He's seated there on the right. What is he doing? Yeah, he's playing tableau. He's playing some backgammon. And as he was sitting there, one of Fulk's soldiers walked by the front of the tavern, saw him sitting there, recognized him, rushed into the tavern, and you can see what he's about to do. Stabbed him in the head, shouting, "On behalf of King Fulk." Well, Hugh was severely wounded. He was not prepared for this attack. And he was carried down to Jaffa, put on the boat to Italy, got to Italy all right, but it was clear that he was going to be brain damaged for the rest of his life, and then he died. Melisande was absolutely furious, as only an Armenian queen can be furious. And nothing that Fulk said or did could convince her that he had not had anything to do with that attack. He tried. Fulk swiftly handed the knight over to the court for justice. The knight swore up and down that he had acted on his own. Fulk knew nothing about it. It was a spur-of-the-moment opportunity that he saw, and he did it. And they couldn't get him to say otherwise, even though they dismembered him. The queen was not satisfied. Fulk was banished from the royal bedroom and warned not to come anywhere near her apartments. His people feared assassination for months at the hands of her agents. She was queen after all, and with the support of the nobility, she reclaimed her power after Fulk's terrible mistake. They did eventually reconcile 5 or 6 years later, perhaps partly thanks to gifts like this one. A prayer book that Fulk had made for his wife, combining Armenian and Byzantine artistic styles. These are just a few of the lavish illuminations in this little manuscript. It was really a kingly gift. Combining all of these beautiful illustrations with an ivory cover that had a big program of ornamentation. Not only was it a tour de force of carving, but all of the symbols on here were about the rights and obligations of royal power. And to his credit, Fulk, who truly did love Melisande, became a changed man. People described him after this as unwilling to take even a single step in the kingdom without consulting her. They had a second son. They agreed on a division of power. She would run internal affairs and oversee building projects. He ran the military and did external diplomacy. Here are a few of the things that she had the opportunity to build. Has anyone been to Israel, Palestine? Anybody recognize this? It looks a little bit different nowadays. This is Nebi Samwid. It's the place, as you're coming up from the coast in Israel towards Jerusalem, you reach the top of a peak, and it's the first place where you could, now Jerusalem has expanded so much you can't, but you could actually look from this point and see the wall of the old city of Jerusalem. And all pilgrims were brought there so that they could have a first view of the holy city that was the next stage on their journey. So she built this beautiful structure in order to receive pilgrims at this site and to mark the tomb of the prophet Samuel. This is the view that you get from it. She also built, for the old city of Jerusalem, several covered markets. This is one of them. This is the Souk al-Aqarim, the spice market. Looks almost the same now as it did then. She did a great job on it. She gave to the Armenians the chapel of St. Gregory in the basement section of Holy Sepulchre Church. She built the Church of St. Anne, which at that point was almost outside the city. She built it in part because her youngest sister, Yvette, chose not to marry but to become a nun, and she entered the convent here. This is what the church looks like from the front. And from the inside, you can see that it has Armenian elements. It has 3 altars, which is normal for an Armenian church. It also has the finest acoustics anywhere in the Middle East. Yvette had a good voice. And then one day, after she's done all of these kinds of things, reconciled with her husband, they now have a second son. It's spring 1143, and the royal family went on a picnic in order to enjoy the warm weather. And Fulk and his friends went off to chase rabbits on horseback. And his horse stepped in a hole, throwing the king headfirst from the saddle onto a rock. And you can see him falling here. He died of the concussion, and Melisande truly and deeply mourned for him. And she was absolutely right to do so, because with him gone, she did take full power, conveniently ignoring the rights of her son when he got older, and she then made, without Fulk, a series of very bad political and military decisions that finally forced her son to remove her from power completely in a coup. And she never saw it coming. Meanwhile, while she's mourning her husband and having to do with all these other things, and even as she was negotiating her marriage to Fulk, she had to worry about her sisters. Her sister Odierna married this guy kneeling here in green. His name is Raymond. He's the Prince of Tripoli. He was a good bit older than his very lovely young wife, and they were having marital problems, just as Melisande had a million other things to deal with. Raymond was a very jealous man, and when rumor suggested that his and Odierna's daughter Melisande was not really his child, and he really had no way to check that, he tried to lock his wife up in a tower. It sounds like something out of a fairy tale, but he actually tried to do it. And of course, you can't just do that to your wife. So Melisande, and Baldwin was still alive at the time, they went north to try and intervene and settle this dispute. Odierna and Raymond were reconciled, and part of the agreement was that they would have a little cooling off period, and Odierna would come back to Jerusalem and spend some time with Melisande. Raymond accompanied her out of the city gate and rode with them for a little while. And then when he returned back to the city, he was ambushed by assassins who killed him. And suddenly, Odierna, who's just been reconciled with him maybe a day before, found herself as the regent for their young son, in full and legitimate power over the third largest Crusader principality. Now, truth be said, it might be that Raymond actually did have a little bit of reason to worry about his beautiful and impetuous and very romantic wife. A European poet, having heard of her beauty from reports by pilgrims, fell in love with her without ever having seen her and began writing some pretty steamy poetry to her. And he ultimately followed his infatuation to the Middle East because he really, really wanted to see her in person. But as he was on board the boat crossing the Mediterranean, he was taken ill. And finally, by the time they put him ashore at Tripoli, he was dying. Somebody took a message to Odierna in her palace and said, look, this man has come all the way from Europe just to see you. He's dying for love of you, etc., etc. Well, she ran down to the beach and sat on the sand, you can see her here, and held him in her arms until he died. Now, if I were Raymond, I might find that was a little odd. Melisande and Odierna's other sister, Alice, was a real piece of work, as they say where I come from. She was married to this man. All right, he's not everybody's cup of tea. But he was like 6'3", blonde and blue-eyed, Bohemond II of Antioch, who seems in fact to have demanded marriage to her as a condition for his coming to the Middle East in order to take on his father's position in Antioch. The couple had a daughter named Constance, after Bohemond's mother, but she was barely 2 years old when her father died. These women were very unfortunate in the lifetimes of their husbands. And Alice was completely devastated because she was very attached to him. And while she was very, very devastated, she was also really, really, really angry because instead of allowing her to become the official regent for her little daughter, as was her legal right, her father and her new brother-in-law, Fulk, whom she did not like, came to Antioch in order to take the regency for themselves and to relegate her to the nursery. She was really furious about this. And so she did something that was a little bit unwise. She sent a message to the nearest Muslim prince, offering to submit Antioch to his authority if he would help her hold power for her daughter. In other words, if the Muslim prince would defend her right to rule Antioch, she would submit to him. Well, unfortunately, her messenger was going out of the city gate as her father and her brother-in-law were coming in. And the poor guy was searched. The message was found. Of course, it's going to be looked on as treason. The messenger was killed in a very nasty way for carrying the message. Don't shoot the messenger did not apply in this case, and he would have been glad if they had just shot him instead of what they did to him. Then there was a really stormy scene between Alice and her father, and she, of course, backed down. But she didn't forget. And as soon as her father died, Alice tried again. Her daughter was about 6. This time, she started a rebellion against her sister's husband, Fulk. She still didn't like him. And she joined together with other Crusader princes in the northern part of the kingdom. They began a war. Fulk defeated her coalition. And the regency of Antioch, again, is not given to her. It's given to some no-name knight over whom she had no influence. And she was just seething at this point, having been thwarted twice in her desire to rule for her daughter. But a few years later, she did get one more opportunity, and this is in a way the best and the worst of them all. By this time, her daughter was almost of marriageable age. Constance was 9. People married young in those days. So, Alice arranged for little Constance to be engaged to the crown prince of the Empire of Byzantium. This is a real coup for her diplomacy. Fantastic marriage, couldn't ask for a better one. But the Crusader nobility in the kingdom didn't want a Greek interfering in their region. So they pretended that they didn't know anything about these negotiations, that what Alice had already done. So they pretended that there's nothing going on, we're going to take care of this. And so they invited a French nobleman named Raymond of Poitiers, who was in his mid-30s at the time, to come to Antioch and marry Constance. But they said, we're going to do this very hush-hush, because they knew Alice would never agree to this marriage. So instead, they did a really nasty end run around her. There was a former bishop in Antioch who had a score to settle with her, and so they roped him into their plan. And the bishop was sent to talk with Alice, make nice to Alice, and convince Alice that Raymond, who was very good looking apparently, and a very good catch, was coming to the east to marry her. And he never said that. The bishop never said that. He just implied it 60 ways from Sunday. This is a picture of Raymond of Poitiers in the yellow, welcoming the French king to his kingdom on one of their state visits. Well, Alice was very happy to understand the bishop's message the way she wanted to understand it, and it made perfect sense. She was only a couple of years younger than Raymond. It would have been a perfect match in every way. And on the day he was to arrive, she was very excited, and she prepared herself to meet her suitor in her apartment. And he had actually arrived, but when he arrived, he very quickly headed for the cathedral, where the nefarious bishop was waiting with little Constance, and they had a 5-minute wedding. And when the marriage was completed, Raymond did go to greet Alice in her apartment and knelt to her as my dear mother-in-law. She was humiliated. She was beyond humiliated. And this time, she gave up. She left public life, retired to the lands that had been her dowry in La Cartier, and died there just a few years later, still in her 30s. Poor Constance. She loved her husband and their 5 children. But when she was in her early 20s, she was widowed suddenly when he was killed by Muslim troops in a battle that the Crusaders only lost because there was a sandstorm that blew the wrong way. And not only was her husband killed, he was beheaded by a man named Shirkuh, who was the uncle of Saladin, and his head was put in a silver box and sent to the Caliph in Baghdad as a gift. That's gruesome. That's really ugly. Poor Constance refused to remarry. She said, I don't want to remarry for anybody else's political agenda. I will only remarry if I find a man who is as good looking and as nice to me as my husband was. Well, handsome is as handsome does, they say. She did choose a second husband eventually. His name was Reynald de Chatillon. His name means the fox. And he lived up to his name by being a good-looking scoundrel of the very first water. What can you do? By the time that Melisande died in 1161, with her 2 remaining sisters by her side to help her after the stroke that left her unable to speak or to move, she had lived a little less than 6 decades of very high drama. Almost overthrown by her husband, ousted by her own son, she had lost 1 sister and 2 brothers-in-law. She had put out endless family fires, and she had done her very best to keep the Crusader East together for her descendants. She had built magnificent buildings, and she had endowed the Armenian and the Syrian communities of Jerusalem very handsomely. She was buried here, near her mother, in a modest chapel, on the stairs that lead down into the crypt of the tomb of the Virgin Mary in Gethsemane. Her tomb is now completely covered up by liturgical furniture. but it is still marked by an almost invisible Armenian dome, which you can find if you know where to look. Power for these Armenian women came at the cost of great heartbreak and struggle. They had not asked for power, well, except for Elise, who kept asking and never got as much as she wanted, but power had come to them by chance or by fate or by the hand of God, however you want to think about it. And although they had not courted its favor, it extracted from them a full and weighty price for their attempt to wield power well. Will there ever be another such moment in history when Armenian women rule a world? Who knows? It's not impossible. But perhaps it's enough that there actually was such a time once, and that those women left their mark not only on the history of the Crusader East, not only on the genetics of their offspring, but on the lives and on the psyches of many generations